ජයගමු ශ්‍රී ලංකා ජූනි 14 සහ 15 හලාවත ශර්ලි කොරයා ක්‍රීඩාංගණයේදී.
Group 14 for unforgettable memories through the power of music.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. Distinguished guests and friends, good morning. It gives me great pleasure to be here this morning as Sri Lanka Sumitrayo celebrates half a century of unprecedented, dedicated service to the people of our country. The uniqueness of Sumitrayo is that it is an organization of care, of concern, of generosity and of support. Peopled by a team who is deeply committed to the service that you provide for the rural farming communities, urban institutions, corporates, drug dependents, for those who are stressed, emotionally distraught and suicidal, in fact for anyone who requires your assistance. Let me begin by a little story which I'm not too proud of. As a student of Muses College in the 1970s, I remember walking by Sumitrayo quite often, though I can't quite remember exactly when. I recall my friends and I were quite intrigued by the organization. Once, with the arrogance of adolescence, a group of us fabricated a story of parental abuse. And I presented myself as a victim to one of your counselors. It was a teenage prank, and your counselors at the time were greatly annoyed when we confessed that it was a lark, and we were given a hard and very sound reprimand, which we accepted with good grace. But looking back over the years, I have experienced some remorse over the incident. So, over 40 years later, allow me to apologize to you formally for exploiting and wasting your time, your limited resources, and most importantly, your goodwill, due to the ignorance and insensitivity of youth. Once again, thank you for inviting me to commemorate the occasion. I consider your invitation a significant honor, and I'm delighted to offer some thoughts on gender identity and maybe a little bit on mental health. However, I have restricted myself only to the portion of the very broad mandate assigned to me by you for two reasons. Firstly, the constraints of time, and secondly, there seems to be a dearth of common knowledge with regard to this concept of gender identity, its history, and its manifold understandings in the collective public imagination. This was evinced by some of the arguments presented to the Supreme Court of Sri Lanka by petitioners against the Bill on Gender Equality. Generally speaking then, the terms sex and gender have often been used interchangeably. Yet historically, the word sex has been used to classify a person as a man or woman based on their external genitalia at birth. A penis and XY chromosomes indicating male, and a vulva and XX chromosomes indicating female. Thus, the male and female are perceived as binary and oppositional identities to one another, centered on differences in physical appearance and biology. And by that I mean the physical, chemical, chromosomal, gonadal, and anatomical composition of an individual. In the past, the sex of a person was generally considered fixed and permanent in their bodies and applied as a co-analytical category, a principal social division, and a form of stratification. Originally, the idea of gender was that of the socially, culturally constructed differences between men and women, again posed as binary oppositions, depending on the extent to which women and men are socialized or they learn gender. course, we have our own mental images of who is a man and who is a woman. A gender identity can be understood to artificially extend or exaggerate what are considered to be the natural and binary differences of sex. And what constitutes a gender identity of a man or a woman, as you know, will depend on their age, their families, the time periods in which they live, the cultures, politics, societies, ethnicities, religions, etc. In this sense, gender can be seen as constructed, contingent and shifting. And as a feminist scholar in the 1980s and 1990s, our interest in gender stopped at that. It was all very straightforward. We researched how social, cultural, psychological, gendered expectations affected the lives of women and girls. For instance, I remember our findings in a qualitative study on sexual harassment conducted by the Center for Women's Studies and UNFPA, where all our interviewees referred to multiple incidents of harassment beginning from childhood. It indicated that women and girls tend to be vulnerable to harassment throughout their lifetime, irrespective of age. Sexual harassment was subject to opportunity and the common gendered perception of girls and women as sexual objects. In fact, some respondents described the mental stress involved in constantly being mentally alert to the possibility of harassment under any circumstances. Of course, this may be changing in the 21st century with the online sexualization of boys and men. Unlike in the 80s and 90s, by the 2020s, understandings pertaining to gender have become expanded and diversified due to the recognition that not everyone is psychologically in tandem with their biological sex. In other words, the way in which people feel about themselves and their gender do not always match their biology. For instance, though born women, some people may feel internally that they are actually men trapped in women's bodies and vice versa. In fact, we have had 2 students in the Department of English at the University of California over the last few years who have expressed their anguish and their confusion about this biological and psychological disparity. One individual in particular could not confide his torment to his parents due to their rigid understandings of sex and gender. Therefore, sex or the biological can no longer be taken for granted as natural or static or even as irreversible, given that science has responded to alleviate the suffering of those with sex-gender incongruencies. With scientific innovations and interventions to physical bodies such as sex reassignment, gender affirmation surgery, or hormonal therapies. Consequently, both sex-based identity and gender-based identity can now be seen as fabricated and contingent and shifting. And in terms of a spectrum or a range of gender possibilities, and not only in relation to the bipolarity that was discussed earlier. Now, let us be frank. For many of us, this is an area of identity that is unknown. For some, even inviolable, and can cause some of us great discomfort. Yet, as you know, gender diversity is not a new phenomenon. Historically, all countries have had a third sex or gender, usually where all genders are lumped together, all genders that are not female and male are lumped together and called this third sex. In Sri Lanka, traditionally we talk of the napunsaka or the ponnaya, especially to cause offence. I'm sure you are familiar with the hijras or kinna in India, the kathos in Thailand, the badakhe in North American Indian cultures, the fafafine in Samoa, the bernesha in the Balkans, and the buginis in Indonesia. In recent times, some countries have officially acknowledged a third gender. Australia, Canada, Germany, India, Nepal, New Zealand, Pakistan, Philippines, Thailand, UK, and some states of the United States. Yet alienation, discrimination, social taboos towards marginalized gender identities continues. The Sri Lankan LGBTQI++ communities and their allies have been struggling and fighting for their rights for decades. Given the misery of those whom societies have condemned due to what they believe are abnormalities, I think that we need to overcome our subconscious assumptions and cultural prejudices. In order to do so, we need to be open and be ready to understand and to be conscious of the terms, vocabulary, and definitions related to gender identities that are now being recognized and accepted globally as never before. However, I must confess the list of terms utilized to define these distinct gender identities are extensive and they are evolving fast. And what is considered to be appropriate and politically correct today may not be so tomorrow. Let me briefly refer to some of these identities for those of you who are not familiar with gender diversity or the spectrum of gender. And I hope this is not going to land me in hot water. Now, for some people, their birth, sex identity and gender identity match. Both the biological composition and their psychological sense of being will identify as being male or as female. They are comfortable in their bodies. As you know, this population is called cisgender. On the other hand, there are some people whose internal understanding of gender may not correspond with their external bodies, resulting in gender incongruence. These individuals may identify mentally in terms of the binary opposite sex as either male or female, and attempt to rectify the sex-gender anomaly by transitioning physically in order to align their biological identity with their mental identity. As you may be aware, some trans people may express their gender identity only in terms of appearance. Others may be in the process of taking hormonal treatment. Yet others may have undergone gender affirmation surgery and transitioned completely. Furthermore, some trans people may feel that they cannot subscribe to the extreme polarity of what has been constructed as men and women. They may feel that their sense of gender exists somewhere in between the male and female at different points along what is considered to be the gender spectrum. Other gender identities include intersex, a collective term for babies who have external genitalia, internal organs, or chromosomes that do not fit the standard boxes of what is typically understood to be male or female. Or they may possess a combination of both male and female biological traits, physical, chemical, chromosomal, and gonadal. They are thus assigned as intersex by doctors and sometimes surgically assembled into what the medical practitioners conclude to be viable in terms of male or female at the time of birth, which may differ from the feelings of the intersex individuals. Then there is the identification with gender queer, another umbrella term to describe identities which are fluid, gender diverse, or non-binary, involving various forms of gender expression. Genderqueer people may identify as having aspects of both male and female identities, or neither. You can see how the word queer, that has historically been considered pejorative or abusive in the English language, has now been resurrected positively and even politicized. Yet another category of gender diversity consists of agender people who are gender neutral. They do not identify with any particular gender identity. Consequently, their gender identity is non-existent. Now I can go on, but I will leave it at that. Even though, as I noted earlier, new identities are constantly being developed globally. I have no doubt that during the course of your work, you would have come across people who have been psychologically troubled, not only by their internal sex-gender conflicts, but also by the drastic reactions of their families and their communities and the state, who do not have the knowledge or the sensitivity to deal with their trauma. Or people who have experienced gender phobia or transphobia, which may manifest in actions such as violence, harassment, misrepresentation, and exclusion. Needless to say, the official sanctioning of gender diversity requires social transitioning as well, including changes in pronouns, the adoption of new names, changes to dress and appearance. It also involves legal transitioning, official name changes and clear identity cards and clear birth certificates. Now, I am not asserting here that some of the changes in Western countries pertaining to gender transitioning have been unproblematic. For instance, physical transitioning at puberty remains a contentious issue, with some trans people wanting to revert back in adulthood. Women victims of sexual and gender-based violence are worried about male predators exploiting the usage of women's public toilets. Some sportswomen are concerned about the unfair advantage of hormonal treatments and so on. Yet that does not mean that gender diverse communities should continue to be marginalized, subjugated, and denied their rights. As a country, we need to formulate our own solutions, policies, and laws. Let me conclude my speech by appreciating the voluntary nature of Sumitrayo as an organization, especially in an era of commercialization. Thank you for your dedication and generosity to generations of people in our country who have benefited and found solace with your support. Given the complex challenges of the 21st century, such as gender issues, your goal and mission as an institution remains as vital as ever. While congratulating you on your long and successful journey so far, I wish you the courage and strength to continue your remarkable work. Thank you.